So we process the world around us through our senses, the visual images that we see, the auditory, the sounds that we hear, the kinesthetic, our emotions, our feelings, the ability to touch and be aware of our body and movement, as well as olfactory, smell, and gustatory, taste. Our senses gather some 11 million bits of information per second from our environment around us. But our conscious minds can only process about 50 bits of information per second. So we are constantly filtering out and deleting information to make it more manageable for our brains to understand. Therefore, we attend to a very limited experience. In the book, Six Blind Elephants, Volume 1 by Steve Andreas, he says, our flow of awareness is like a very small moving flashlight, sequentially illuminating tiny areas of an immense darkness. So when we talk about scope, we are referring to that raw sensory experience, like the visual, the kinesthetic, or auditory, that we take in before we give it some name or meaning. But more specifically, how much of that information we are aware of or attending to. We are constantly limited by our specific focus of attention. Now, recently I was away, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night and saying to myself, where the hell am I? It was dark and unfamiliar, and I started taking in the raw sensory experience. I remember seeing like shadows, and then it was forming into furniture, and then I started getting a sense of the layout of the room. I was trying to listen to any distinctive sounds. I remember feeling the sheets in the bed that I was in. And then I started giving it some meaning. Like, oh, that's right, this is a hotel room. I'm away in San Diego. So our experience of scope, the senses we attend to, occur in space and time, or both. So I want to talk today about how we do alter scope, especially through widening scope or narrowing scope. Now, when I like to think of narrowing scope as getting really specific or particular, like probing for more information. If I were to do a Google search, for instance, like I would, if I were, instead of doing a Google search on a car, for instance, I might be doing a search for the exact year, make, model, or even color of that car, like an aquamarine 1957 Bel Air Chevy convertible. So a way of exploring scope in space is through perceptual positions, or stepping into the self, or another person, or an objective observer when we are recalling our memories or experiences. So when you associate in or relive an event as if it's happening now, we are taking on our direct experience at the time. For instance, if we're at like a concert, right, we might see the band through our eyes. We might listen to the band through our ears, and we might get a sense of how the music moves us inside, right? It's a more narrow or limited scope of experience because it's what we see, feel, and hear directly. And when we are narrowing scope, it is useful when you do want to engage in like a pleasant experience, like a concert, or if we want to concentrate on a task at hand or be in a state of flow. We do it even when we sleep. It's excluding outside information that's not useful for us at the time, right? We're focusing on the immediate at hand. Now, if you were to relive that same concert experience as an objective observer, say security working the event, you might see that you over there watching the band and all the other people watching the band. You might get a sense of the bartenders filling drinks and a bunch of people on the bathroom line. You're essentially widening or expanding your field of vision and exploring this experience from a totally different perspective. Now, widening or enlarging scope can be seen as seeing the bigger picture, getting a broader perspective. I like to think of it as being a drone in the sky, and you're kind of documenting everything down below, all the people at play in an expansive environment, right? When I'm walking, especially in a packed room, I tend to narrow scope. I'm just looking for like open spaces to maneuver through. I've had friends walk in that same packed room and immediately say, wow, this is overwhelming, because they're expanding their awareness, they're widening their scope and taking in all the other people in the room. So when we are narrowing and widening scope and time, we are focusing our attention on the time represented inside that memory or experience. For instance, a runner may have a snapshot in mind of crossing the finish line in a marathon as their example of athleticism. That finish line, that moment in time, is a narrow scope. If that runner began to expand that time frame beyond that finish line, perhaps weeks and months, I like to think of it as spreading time out a bit like an accordion, right? They might notice that athleticism existed the entire year before crossing that finish line, when they were training for that event the whole entire time. And it could also exist even after, as they're training for the next one. Now, you might think an example of consistency would be like something as simple as brushing your teeth for a couple minutes each day. But even if you were began to expand the time frame beyond those 2 minutes, before or after those 2 minutes, you might also realize, oh, I also consistently like make my bed, my breakfast daily, right? So when widening scope, we also get to explore the causes of events in our lives. An example in the Six Blind Elephants book is, I remember reading, it was basically about author Steve Covey mentioning like sitting in a subway car. And a man and his kids came into the subway car. And the man immediately like sat down and like closed his eyes, and the kids caused chaos. They were like throwing things, they were screaming, they were grabbing people's papers. Covey was just annoyed. And he told the guy, he's like, can you control your kids a bit better, right? The guy sort of like came to and he said, oh yeah, that's right. I should probably do something about that. Because we just left the hospital about an hour ago where their mother died. He goes, I don't know what to think about it. And I guess they don't know how to handle it either. And immediately Covey just dropped his irritation and felt a sense of compassion for the man and his kids. And even upon hearing this story, we are widening scope from the subway car and expanding it back into the past to get a sense of how that man and his kids must have felt in the hotel, in that hospital room, receiving that type of information, right? So, and we can also expand scope by examining consequences of our events and lives. I remember speaking to a few people who questioned their sense of compassion because they made certain decisions at the time. But when they began to essentially explore the consequences of their actions, or even potential consequences of their actions, they realized they were being compassionate in the long run, because they were breaking off toxic relationships or friendships that would have been destructive if they persisted out into the future. Now, there are some disadvantages to both narrowing and widening scope. When we narrow scope, we tend to call it tunnel vision or having blinders on, because we do have the potential of excluding information that can be useful. Since I used to only narrow scope when I walked, I remember this particular time when my friend said to me, Lonnie, did you see Christopher Walken pass us by? And I only got to see the side of his head. Recently, a friend of mine said that she saved a child from nearly drowning in the ocean because The parent of that child just averted her attention, averted her eyes for just a few minutes to solely talk to her friends. Now, a way to notice if we are eliciting a narrow scope in a potentially limiting way is to notice if we're using words like just or only, if we're thinking in rigid definitions or limited context, if we're directing our attention to only one possibility. If you've ever met someone with a victim mentality, he or she are seeing and feeling and hearing from their narrow scope of the self. But if they were to step into the shoes of someone else, they may begin to see themselves a bit differently. And if we widen a bit too large, taking too much information, we could get a sense of overwhelm, like my friends in the crowd, or get a sense of confusion because we don't get a sense of what the next smallest step that we can take. I've met people devastated by climate change and pollution and poverty who just feel like helpless to do anything about it. But if they were even to begin to narrow the scope, they might begin to notice all the immediate actions they can take to make a difference, like cleaning up their parks or beaches. Frankly, what it comes down to is this: we all do this unconsciously, but if we become more aware of all the ways we are already narrowing and widening the scope in our day-to-day lives and begin to alter scope, it will help us problem solve really difficult situations in our lives. We can shift our awareness, we can direct our attention to some new or different information, and we can respond in a way that just serves us better.